קילפתי תפוס, מצאתי בפנים, כמו בתוך קן, ילד ישן, ילד ישן. הילד אמר, אתה עשית פה חור, תקן את הפלח, נושב עליי קור, נושב עליי קור.
קילפתי תפוס, מצאתי בפנים, מה?
כמו בתוך קן, ילד ישן, ילד ישן.
ילד אמר,
אתה עשית פה חור, תקן את הפלח, נושב עליי קור,
נושב עליי קור.
אמרתי רגע,
סליחה,
שלום, ואת הפרחים שמתי במקום, ועד היום, אם הוא לא יצטנן, בתוך התפוס, ילד ישן, ילד ישן.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a moment. We see people are still joining us. Welcome. Good evening. I'm Nancy Berg of Washington University in St. Louis with Naomi Sokolov from the University of Washington. We're here with a number of the contributors to our volume, Since 1948, Israeli Literature in the Making, and we'll be introducing them in just a moment. First, we want to thank our departments, the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle East Studies here at Washington University, and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at University of Washington, as well as the Israel Institute for co-sponsoring this event. We also want to thank Simone Beck for all of her help in putting this together. This is the plan for the next hour. We'll start with our panelists saying a few remarks about their own chapters and answering questions from us, then open up to a discussion of questions and answers. We're finishing with questions from the audience. Feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as we can. This book project grew out of a conference held here at Washington University in 2018, in which we wanted to look at Israeli literature since its beginnings, reconsider received wisdoms, recover, reassess, and recalibrate. We open not unexpectedly with questions of definitions and boundaries and canons. Looking at 3 moments of canon formation, we explore the central tension between the efforts to formulate a linear narrative and the lively, messy, expansive, constantly changing literary scene that defies those efforts. We'd like to begin with giving you a taste of the book by going around our virtual room and giving each panelist in turn an opportunity to talk about his or her contribution. We're going to start with Michal Rezin, now an associate professor of comparative literature at Ohio Wesleyan. Michal?
All right. Thank you, Nancy and Naomi, for organizing this launch. I'm going to start by defining a term for you, 2 terms actually. So my chapter is called Sounding the Mizrahi Voice. For those unfamiliar with the term Mizrahi, it refers to Jewish immigrants from the Arab world. In the 1950s and 60s, there was an influx, and to their subsequent generations. So my chapter looks at novels by 2 Iraqi-Israeli authors from different generations. And I'm looking at the representation of the hafla. So now what is a hafla? In its original context, a hafla refers to a soiree that starts in the evening and goes sometimes to the wee hours of the morning. You have a singer who evokes this ecstatic reaction from the audience, and it's a journey. It takes the listener on a journey through time and space, and it's very melancholic typically. So I look at these representations of the hafla in Israeli literature and Mizrahi literature specifically, and how the term has evolved. Your average Israeli knows the term, but it's really been diluted and culturally appropriated, one can argue, from its original context, these all-night events, to basically today, you mentioned the term, and it's just a party with Middle Eastern flair, and really appropriated to the sense that sometimes these sounds are sampled in rock music or just floating on the radio, but really unmoored from their context. So what I see these two authors, again, of different generations doing is they take the term and they're using it, imagery and actual names of artists, from historical artists and contemporary, and they're using it to mark pivotal moments in their journeys, in their respective journeys. So if we look at Eli Amir, he's the generation of the immigrants, and he has a trilogy, the Iraq trilogy, and it moves from the exodus from Iraq, and then it goes to the arrival in Israel and through his protagonist's service in the Israeli army. And then you have a third generation Iraqi Israeli named Almog Behar, who he basically frames the Hafla as the moment in which his protagonist comes into being as a poet. And he has this beautiful image of his language and his cultural background is a bilingualism of Hebrew and silence. And the Hafla in this context really probes what is that silence and what is that Hebrew.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Wendy Zerler, who we're delighted could join us. She is the Sigmund Falk Professor of Feminist Studies and Modern Jewish Literature at HUC-JIR. And would you like to say a few things about your chapter?
Sure. My chapter was called Anthological Poetics, and it deals with the way in which ostensibly secular Israeli poetry has been incorporated of late in liberal prayer books in Israel and as well as in the United States. And what it probes is the whole question of anthologizing and what happens to the meaning of a poem depending on where it's situated anthologically. And the history of anthologizing of poetry in the state of Israel is a long hallowed history. The whole project of canon formation in Israel involved various successive projects of anthologizing poems to make an argument about the Israeli culture. And of late, liberal Jews in Israel have taken it upon themselves to write the new chapter of poetic anthologizing by including, in some cases, hundreds of Israeli poems as part of a new version of a prayer book, which includes traditional prayers as well as these previously secular poems. And the anthological placement of a secular poem next to a canonical prayer, I argue, affects a new meaning making in both directions. So by situating a poem by Yehuda Amichai next to a psalm from Kabbalat Shabbat, one suddenly understands the psalm as well as the Amichai poem in a new light. And so it talks about this idea of juxtapositional or anthological poetics as effecting new meaning making. And the chapter also tries to reformulate, or I should say, blur the conventional boundaries between what one might expect as the secular versus the religious in Israel, and show that those definitions are not so easily or readily presented anymore.
Thank you. Shachar Pinsker is Professor of Judaic Studies and Middle East Studies and the Associate Director at the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan.
Okay, thank you. So my chapter is called When Yiddish Was Young in Israel. And like Michal's chapter and like other chapters in the book, it really kind of asks what is Israeli literature, and challenges our assumption, or the assumption of many people, that Israeli literature is really synonymous with only literature in Hebrew, which is the national and the major language. And what my chapter is really trying to do is to ask us, how do we look at Israeli literature in a different way if we seriously consider what was written in Yiddish by Yiddish writers who wrote mainly in the 50s and 60s, but really all the way until today. So, when I start with when Yiddish was young in Israel, we normally think of Yiddish as the language of the old people, but it was young with a group of young Israel, and it continues to be young today. It's a large topic, and I'm actually trying to complete now a whole book about it, but in the chapter, I really chose just a few examples, and if I may, I want just to hear the words of what Israel Yiddish sounds like. So Avrom Sutzkever wrote in 1948, soll ich onheben von Honheb, soll ich wie Avrom ois Bruderschaft zerhacken alle Getzen. Shall I start from the beginning? Shall I, a brother like Abraham, smash all the idols? And it really is a dialogue with maybe a Hebrew writer who tells the Yiddish writer, why Yiddish? Why in Israel? What is the point of that? So I start with this, and then I look at bilingual writers like Yosef Birstein, like Benjamin Arshav, who's really a scholar and a poet, and see how they write in Yiddish, and how writing in Yiddish forces us to think in a different way about all kinds of things, about the Israeli landscape, about issues like 1948, the connection between the Holocaust and the trauma of what happened in 1948 in the war, and really an invitation for us to rethink about Israeli literature as a multilingual.
Thank you. Melissa Weininger is the Anna Smith Fine Lecturer and the Associate Program Director of the Program in Jewish Studies at Rice University. Melissa?
Thanks again for organizing this, Nancy and Naomi. And actually, Shachar's work provides a really nice segue into my own, because while he is writing about the way that the Israeli Yiddish literature challenges the idea that Israeli literature is only in Hebrew, I've been writing about, and my chapter also deals with, Hebrew literature that challenges the idea that Hebrew literature is only Israeli or only belongs in Israel. And so my chapter is about two contemporary novels, both of which focus on diasporic spaces as Jewish national spaces or homelands, or construct Jewish homelands in a sense, either imaginatively or actually in their novels. The first novel is Nava Semmel's Israel, which is translated as Israel, which imagines an alternative history in which Mordechai Manuel Noah's dream of creating the Jewish homeland in Grand Isle, New York has been realized. And the other novel is Abayit Asher Nechrav by Ruby Namdar, which is a very recent book that imagines a world in which Jerusalem quite literally, and the temple in Jerusalem specifically, quite literally invades New York, or sort of becomes present or realized in New York. And so what this work and some of the other literature that I've been working on sort of play with is this idea that Hebrew is tethered to Israel, and also the idea that Israel represents a unitary, monolithic notion of homeland for Jews. So it plays with both idea of homeland, language, the connections between those, and nationalism and national culture.
Thank you. And now Shai Ginsberg is Associate Professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Duke University. Shai, if you could unmute and tell us about your chapter.
Thank you, Nancy, Naomi. Thank you, all of you, for taking part in the wonderful conference that gave rise to this volume. My chapter deals with Israeli children literature, and I actually seek to read children literature seriously. That is, what would we discover if we read children literature as we read adult literature, as an attempt to intervene in the politics, in the social conditions, social circumstances of Israel at the time. This was both an attempt on my part to reread the children literature that I loved so much as a kid, but also to review the books I read to my own kids. So it gave me a wonderful opportunity to look at this and to actually wonder about what has changed and what remained constant throughout Israeli history in the way Israeli children authors approach their young audience. I look more specifically at space, and my argument is basically that Israeli authors or writers writing for kids are very conscious of the question of space, which is, of course, one of the main tropes, one of the main concerns of Israel has been from its establishment to the present. And I read their fiction or their poetry as commenting on that question, commenting very seriously on that question, and commenting on how politicians address this question of space. So I start with Hassamba, which is perhaps the most popular children's series to have been published in Israel, still popular today. And I go through Shlonsky, who besides being a very important poet for adults, also wrote some wonderful children poetry. And then to Dvorah Omer, probably the most famous Israeli authors for children and young adults. And then move on to more contemporary authors, writers like Nurit Zarhi and Yanetz Levi.
Thank you. And Naomi Sokolov, the professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of Washington. Naomi.
Thank you, Nancy. So my essay focuses on memoirs by Ilona Frankel, and in particular on how they combine animal themes with Frankel's memories of childhood during the Holocaust. And what I argue is that animal studies can provide a productive lens for reading those texts and for rereading a range of other Israeli literature that deals with the Holocaust. Approaches from the field of animal studies can highlight how Nazi ideology defined Jews as subhuman, and also how Jews experienced and responded to such dehumanization. So in Frankel's case, a significant response that she had was to befriend animals. And similarly, friendships with animals feature prominently in other accounts of hidden children during the war. It's not so surprising because Jews on the run frequently sought refuge in barns or in forests, and sewers and bunkers. And in all of those places, they lived in close proximity to animals, whether farm animals or wild creatures or subterranean urban creatures. And so hidden children occupied an ambiguous space between the realm of human beings and non-human beings. This is a topic I've been working on since I completed the essay, and especially in connection with Aaron Appelfeld's memoir, The Story of a Life, and with Nava Semmel's novel, And the Rat Laughed. So that's how the essay that I did for our volume served as a jumping off point for some other things I've been working on. And now I get to call on some of my colleagues. Next up is Eric Zakim, who is a professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of Maryland. He has served as the director of the program in film studies, and he's also a faculty member at the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies and the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies.
Thanks. I have to say a big thank you to Naomi and Nancy for allowing me to indulge in a kind of marginal exploration. But it's also, before I discuss what that might be, it's fascinating to hear everybody and also to take a look at the book because of the types of intersections and overlappings that everyone's work and most surprisingly to me, mine, finds with what everyone has been saying. I was looking at what's considered in Israel not literature, but pornography. I've always been interested in seeking out in Israel popular culture, especially popular literature. I've always been interested in comic books, which then became graphic literature. I've been interested in searching out erotica. And I became very interested many years ago with this genre of pulp fiction called Stalagim, which all the plots, there were about 100 published in the early 60s, right at the time of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. And they all have a very similar plot, which is an Allied soldier, usually a pilot or some British or American, falls captive to the Nazis in World War II and is taken to a stalag, a prisoner of war camp, which is run by women, SS women guards, of whom there's usually a rather pretty blonde one with a rather always described as curvaceous, let's say, and there's soft porn involved, which is both anxiety producing in the protagonist, but also indulgent in the protagonist's fantasies as well. I, like Shai, I decided to read this literature and read it seriously and really didn't know whether anything would come out of it. I'm now convinced that this is really fascinating stuff that the Israeli establishment, and including the government, tried to suppress. And even to this day, if one searches the catalog of the National Library in Jerusalem, the literature is not, it's listed as literature in translation because the authors were all hidden under pseudonyms, and there were translators listed as if this were foreign literature from English, from America, that was then translated into Hebrew. And I think it really does tell us something about the moment of the early 60s, both in terms of Eichmann and this kind of public airing of the relationship to the Holocaust, and also in this transformational moment in Hebrew culture and Hebrew literature specifically.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up, we have Ricky Traum. She is on the faculty of Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she teaches English, American, and Jewish literature. And she recently published a collection of poetry by Rina Shani, which she'll tell us about.
Right. Thank you so much. And I thank you, Nancy and Naomi, for organizing that and for thinking ahead of time about the, each of us and about the alternatives that we present and the way we challenge the canon, the Israeli canon. My chapter is Disruptive Nativity, and it focuses on Rina Shani, who was a very prominent voice during the 60s and was totally forgotten until recently. And I hope to get to my book later in this discussion. But it's important to say that to begin with, from the beginning, the chapter had been a part of a larger project, and that eventually became a book. I wanted to, my overall purpose in this project was not only to recover Rina Shani's important voice, but also to challenge, tease the canon, and to redefine, if possible, to suggest an alternative, and also to place Rina Shani in between Yona Volach and Dalia Rabikovic, and Yona Volach, two major women poets of the 60s and the 50s. And in a way, it's a little bit anti-Mexicon, my project. So the article here, in a way, completes my extensive introduction to the book, in a sense that it focuses on Shani's resistance to the entire concept of belonging. And I can select different terms that we heard about boundaries and challenges and the canon and everything. She didn't belong her entire life, her entire very rich career. And so to focus on her aesthetic choices that demonstrate what does it mean to resist, but also the socio-political ideology behind her choices. So I discuss in the chapter two major influences: Leah Goldberg, who was a mentor and teacher, whose foreignness allowed Shani, I think, to shape and form her own version of resistance and foreignness eventually. And her immediate group of artists, contemporary artists back then, Nissim Maloni, the playwright and the translator, and the painter Yossel Bergner, who I think corresponds really well to the writers that Shachar writes about, also because he's Yiddish and so forth. And I really check as the three of them, Shani and Bergner and Nissim Maloni, had a very harsh dialogue with their homeland, with Israel. But both lanes, also Goldberg on one hand, and then Nissim Maloni and Yossel Bergner, led, I think, to the same sense of alienation that I was trying to talk about. And so through tropes and language, certain type of language that I'm interested in, still interested, she forms a type of resistance that is relevant, I think, to us even today. A type of resistance that characterizes native Bnei Makom who feel in exile and yearn for exile, and whose sense of non-belonging is even stronger, I think, than their sense of belonging. And from here is the title, Disruptive Nativity. And this is the exact stance of alienation that characterizes, I think, Shani the most, and I was so interested in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ricky. And last but very much not least, we have Nancy Berg, who's already introduced herself, but let me add that she is a professor in the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at Washington University. And I have had the privilege and the very distinct pleasure of editing another book with her, which was called What We Talk About When We Talk About Hebrew. And she wrote an essay for our current volume on literary prizes.
Thank you. So I wrote about literary prizes as cultural capital, and I really wanted to understand, is it more that literary prizes reflect the canon or shape the canon? And I think that this question is true of literary prizes in general, but there are specific aspects to the question of literary prizes in Israel, some of which are because of the intimacy of the whole, the Branja, the whole branch, the Republic of Letters, that authors and editors and judges and publishers and academics and critics are often the same people. And so this makes it very, very intimate in terms of who gets prizes, who gives prizes, and who doesn't. And so there are personal relations come into play. The questions of definition, of course. Ruby Namdar's book, the one that Melissa was talking about, created a great scandal when it got the Sapir Prize, the so-called Israeli Booker Prize, because it was written by someone who wasn't currently living in Israel. And so again, that gets to the question of homelands, it gets to the question of borders, and the question of definition of Israeli literature. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now I think we're ready for our second round, where we have questions to pose to our different contributors.
Can I just say also, if someone wants to put questions in the question and answer, if the audience has questions, please put them in the Q&A. Thank you. Naomi?
Yeah, so let me start with Shachar, who spoke about a resurgence of interest in Yiddish, which we're seeing both in Israel and in the US. And he spoke about when Yiddish was young in Israel. So Shachar, are there young writers now in Yiddish, or where is the future? What is the future of Yiddish?
Yes, so well, I mean, some people say that Yiddish is dead, you know, already in the 40s and 50s, and Yiddish is kind of the ever-dying language, and it continues to be alive and kicking. So, you know, there are people who are actually producing original Yiddish poetry and fiction. Just last week, they announced people who got a prize. Nancy spoke about prizes, you know, but something else that is happening is young writers like Matan Hermoni and Yad Biran are writing Hebrew novels that are really informed by Yiddish and influenced by the language and the literature. And that's maybe something of that also was going on since 1948, but became even more stronger. And also, it's really interesting to see a new documentary about Sutzkever as part of Ha'ivrim, you know, films about the masters of Hebrew. And then, you know, you also have Sutzkever. And the last thing I want to mention is Ho, that some people might be familiar with, a great and very influential journal edited by Dori Manor, recently published a whole volume about Arabic and Yiddish as the two sisters of Hebrew. And I think it shows that there's a lot of research, interest, both people who are studying Yiddish, people are using Yiddish and finding all these links between Arabic and Yiddish in the context of Israeli literature.
Thank you very much. And now I have a question actually from our audience for Ricky, which I think is parallel in some ways to what you were talking about, Shachar. The question is, was Shani forgotten? Why is there a resurgent interest in her now?
It's a great question. Thank you for the question. Several reasons for that. She's not the only one, but first of all, we have some, you know, social reasons, we have literary reasons, and we have personal reasons. Shani changed her life and changed her environment totally in the 70s. And she changed the type of poetry that she wrote. And this causes certain, I would say even it doubled the alienation that was there anyway. So personal reason, definitely something that we should attend to. But moreover, I think there is also a process of mechika, of effacement, erasement, neglection that we need to take care of. And this is here is my responsibility as a scholar, that to ask the right questions about who actually is in the canon and who is not, and what should we do in order not to forget. And I think we do not pay attention to this important question. We still do not pay attention. And so I think the overall reason we should not forget that with her were other very prominent poets like Daria Ravikovich and Yona Volach. This kind of the inner dynamics within the groups, the literary, the poetic groups. And yet, once again, scholarship and scholars had to pay more attention to this, to her as a poet. So it's a very good question. We should keep asking this type of question. Yes.
Thank you. Now I have a question for Michal, which is a different sort of question. You come to Israeli literature with a very strong background in music and in performance. So can you say something more about the relationship between music and literature, or the uses of music or music themes within Israeli writing?
Absolutely. So if we think about music, it's such a poignant repository for cultural memory. It looks backwards in that sense to the past and longing for the past often, but it can also look forward, and it's a space of great innovation. And it's also an element of community and listening together. And it's literally the acoustics of it. It is the sound of the nation, and it's shifting over time and ebbing and flowing. And so actually, connecting to what Shachar said, it was really interesting hearing you read, because I think music, and when you plug it into literature, it blows open what Hebrew should sound like. And it really blows open that idea that Jewish literature is only in Hebrew. And these Iraqi Israeli authors have brought, specifically the Hafla, but other elements. And I think in some ways it blows open those boundaries of what is Israeli literature, what is Jewish literature, how it connects to the rest of the world, because these novels have been translated into Arabic. And the third generation of musicians that's sometimes featured, Almog Behar, for instance, mentions explicitly an Israeli, originally a rock artist, who went back and recorded in Arabic Dudu Tassa and the Kuwaitis, his grandfather's music in Arabic, gets to the mainstream Israeli radio and out to the Arab world. So it's kind of blowing open the boundaries from the inside and towards the outside. And that's something that's very unique about music, that, ethnomusicologists have noticed about Israeli music, how porous it is. And it's a language unto itself, and it's a poetic universe unto itself. And then you bring in those influences into, or those tropes into the literature. And it's a really poignant way, I think, of asking about the canon and what is Israeli literature when you introduce those different sounds and those different poetic universes.
Can I just give something about what Michal just said? Because I just wanted to add a sort of another layer example to what you said to support it. But another example of this is the group in Berlin, the expatriate Hebrew writers who use the Hafla, their own concept of the Hafla, right, to create kind of community with other refugee and expatriate writers from the Middle East, who are writing in Arabic and German and English sometimes. And, music is one of the tools that they use to make those connections. So.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a poetic hafla that happens on a regular basis, right. And it's a community formation.
Thank you, both of you. And Nancy, I think your takeover now as MC, right?
So, Eric, I wanted to ask you, you've done a lot of work in images and film. And so I wanted to ask a very broad question about what you think the current relationship is between cinema and literature.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a very complicated question. Several years ago, I don't know if you were there at the conference of the National Association of Professors of Hebrew in Montreal. I gave a talk that I thought that cinema in Israel had eclipsed literature as kind of the repository of a dominant national imaginary. And actually, I think that television in the meantime might have supplanted cinema as the locus for the working out of Israeliness. There's a lot going on. I think the relationship is very complex. I think Israel has turned from being a a country of people of the book, as Ben-Gurion famously said in 1951, to being the country of the image. There's so many examples. There's so many wonderful examples to look at in relationship to reading and listening as well.
Thank you. And I think one of those examples, Melissa, you recently wrote on a very new and fresh short story by Etgar Keret that became a film. And you wrote about that. What do you think this idea of making this short story into a film, and not necessarily in Israel or just in Israel, what does that say about the place of Israeli literature in the world? Again, another big question.
Yeah, well, no, it's a really interesting question. And this film itself is particularly important to that conversation, because they actually filmed it simultaneously in Israel and in Japan with like a Zoom link, where the Israeli director was directing the Japanese actors. There's no Hebrew in the film. The only language that you hear is Japanese and like one word of English. It's actually technically two words, social worker, but it's really one word. And so, I mean, a lot like the literature that I look at in my chapter, you know, it kind of constructs this a kind of global space, right? At the end of this film, the Japanese character who's in the television, he's a television announcer, and the Israeli character are sort of lying next to each other, but in reality and actually in the world of the film, they're thousands of miles apart. So it's also a kind of, you know, parable maybe about globalization, and also about some of the things that Eric mentioned about identity construction through image, and, you know, the way that we envision ourselves also differently when we're envisioning ourselves next to each other as a global community. And the short story, of course, is about plague. And it was a short story that was featured in the New York Times as part of their Decameron of plague stories around COVID. And it never mentions COVID, it never mentions a place, but you know, we've heard a lot of this recently about community, and we're sort of all in this together, and, you know, this is happening all over the world. And it makes use of some of those tropes also to, I think, rethink, you know, some of the same ideas that we're reconsidering in this book, you know, boundaries, borders, nationalism, national culture, and what those things mean. You know, when Shachar was talking, I was also thinking about Shtisel as being part of, it's not literature, but it's part of the same resurgence of Yiddish, or maybe not resurgence, but just another example of the way that Yiddish never disappeared, and is still really, you know, a central part of Israeli culture.
Can I add one more thing about that, about film? There's a recent film called Mami, or Red Fields, and it features an Israeli development town in the south of Israel, and it has what looks like a traditional Hafla orchestra, but it is the third generation Mizrahi musicians, Dudu Tassa and Netal Kayam, and they're standing at the edge of the desert and performing. And again, this is a different sound and texture. It harkens back, but this movie is also an interesting critique of militarization, and it just combines a lot of different elements. And Netal Kayam actually went back and learned the Moroccan dialect of her grandparents. And so they're singing in their dialects at the edge of the desert, which is a trope that comes up in a lot of canonical Israeli literature, but you have it refigured here as Mizrahi third generation musicians performing in the gestures that would have been the grand gestures of the Hafla.
Thank you. Not to mention the film based on Eli Amir's book that was filmed entirely in Iraqi Judeo-Arabic or Jewish dialect of Arabic. So now the question for Naomi. You've been thinking a lot about this book, and how has the editing of the book influenced your reading?
So the essays in the book have led me to new directions in my reading. And I do want to mention, first of all, Wendy's piece. It led me to look at the prayer books of the Beit Tfilah Yisraeli, which is a group that meets in Tel Aviv, and which, as she said, incorporates contemporary secular poetry with traditional liturgy. And I discovered there texts that I did not know previously, such as Eli Moar's Tel Aviv Prayer, and multiple songs that are all called Modeh Ani. And I've gotten new awareness of contemporary writers who draw directly on sacred sources, such as Ruchama Weiss. And then from a different essay also about poetry, Eran Selgos, I have been inspired to incorporate poetry by Adi Kesar into some of my courses at the University of Washington. And similarly, Melissa's piece convinced me that I should include Ruby Namdar's novel, The Ruined House, in the course that I'm preparing for next winter. And then Yael Deckel's piece was important, and it led me to read the short story which she translated, which appears at the end of our volume. If any of you have not read the story, I encourage you to do that. So so I learned a lot from all of you, and I was so pleased to be working with you.
I just add something about Naomi, because she wrote about Alona Frenkel, and she's a great artist. I think we discussed it before in Illustrator, and it made me, your essay, go back and look really, explore her art, and she's great. So it made me kind of looking for the dialogue between her, writing and her illustrations, which is really interesting, a very fascinating topic. So thank you.
Shai, we were wondering if you had, maybe if you could give us some reading suggestions for either what we should be reading, what you're currently reading, or maybe some forgotten gems that you'd like to reclaim for us.
So I'll just tell you what I read, and I do it in two directions. First, I read Ottoman history, because I think we don't know enough about this period. As literary scholars, we all talk about the establishment of Hebrew literature in Israel, but we don't know the historical context in which it was done. I actually must say that I shamefully discovered how little I know. Even though I've been working on this period for a long time, I discovered that I actually do not know the social economic context in which Hebrew literature emerged in Palestine. So I highly recommend this. The other thing that I'm reading fiction and poetry that was published in September and October 1949. And this is a very interesting period of time, because the 1948 war has just ended. Israel was in the process of signing ceasefire agreement with its neighbors. And then a group of very prominent poets and writers started thinking about space. I mean, this could be seen as an extension of my piece on children's literature, and about the borders and what it means to have under your control space that was not necessarily populated by Jews before the war. And so if you don't know, within the span of September and October, Samech Yizhar, who was a young MP at the time, wrote Chir B'Tchizeh, published at the beginning of September. At the end of the month, Natan Alterman published Songs on the Land of the Negev, Shirim al Eretz HaNegev. And Uri Tzvi Greenberg published Mina Chachlil and Mina Kachol, which is considered to be one of his finest cycles of poems. And then Leah Goldberg published Lichluchit. All of these are fascinating, again, within 4 weeks. Of course, Uri Tzvi Greenberg was also an MP at the time. So one could think of these poems as having a parliamentary debate over space and sovereignty, all done through fiction and poetry.
That's great. I love the interplay of I love when literature infiltrates the Knesset and other realms of politics. We were asked in the Q&A, Ricky presents herself as sort of an agent of memory, which Esther recognizes in other presentations as well. And was this part of our vision for the conference in the book? And Naomi, you want to take that?
I would like to say yes, but also we were trying to look backward. We were trying to read retrospectively so that we could also be looking at the ways that conventions are being broken now, and particularly ways that understandings of the Israeli canon are being upended and expanded.
Thank you. We're also asked, Yiddish is called the forgotten language, and the Mizrahi poets, authors are often neglected from the canon, from the mainstream. What makes these more prominent nowadays? I think that's a huge question, and I think that several of us have been working on it. I think one is that the canon has opened up, that there's more of a recognition of the non-Ashkenazi, non-secular, non-this, non-that. This is not just an Israeli phenomenon. I also think that there's a critical mass of writers as well as a critical mass of readers. And I think some of it has to do with, let's not be too modest, but the work of those of us in the room that we have been promoting Rina Shani and Yiddish writers and Stelagim and Mizrahi writers and those writing in the outside of Israel in America, and those who write for children and so forth and so on. So I think that's part of it too.
Can I add something?
I'm after you.
Real briefly, because we're going to be wrapping this up.
Very, very briefly. No, I'm just thinking about the fact that in the last couple of years, we lost so many of what is considered to be kind of the canon, the center of Israeli Hebrew literature. You know, Natan Zach and Aaron Appelfeld, and Amos Oz, and so many people.
And Shimon Balas.
And Shimon Balas, right? I mean, I could go on and on and on. It's really sad, but at the same time, the fact that these people are no longer with us, it's kind of a confusing moment because, what is it? I mean, we spoke a lot about canon but now I think we really feel it. It's not just an exercise, and the fact that Israeli literature is now completely open to, you don't know where is the center, where is the margin, is also, I think, part of the rethinking of the history and also the present and the future.
I would be remiss if we don't mention Yaron Peleg, because he also contributed an essay to the volume, and he's grappling with that whole question of what is canon and how is it formed.
Shachar mentioned, can I? Or is it, Shachar mentioned who we lost, and I just want to mention who we gained also, because prior to Shani was a great volume of Tirza Atar, her entire poetry of Tirza Atar, Natan Alterman's daughter. And once again, and like Shani, as Gidon Tikotsky said, it's the same path. She was more of songs and lyrics, and she, we didn't take her seriously enough, as she deserved, by the way. So we gained also. We lost and we gained. We need to say it's an important project. Yes.
And we just want to end by saying thank you to all of you who participated in the panel and in the audience. We didn't get to every question, but we tried. And we just want to toast you all and to say thank you and keep reading.
Keep reading. Chaim.
Sahtain.
Chaim, Sahtain.
Sahtain. Okay.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you. Wonderful to see you.
So great.